So good morning, everyone. It's so nice to see everyone. Thank you for being here. I hope everyone's travels were good. Let me put this up here. All right. I have the pleasure of introducing our first invited speaker. Dr. Joseph Stern is a neurosurgeon. He earned his undergraduate and medical school degrees, as well as completed his internship and residency all at the University of Michigan right here in Ann Arbor. He has trained in palliative care now also through the Harvard Medical School. He's now a clinical assistant professor of neurosurgery at the University of Michigan here in Ann Arbor. And he also has an adjunct assistant professor position in the Department of Neurosurgery at University of North Carolina School of Medicine. And in that role, he teaches medical students and directs the medical humanities program in the Cone Health program at in Greensboro, North Carolina, where he practiced for many years. He also is a co-director of the Cone Health Cancer Center Brain Tumor Program, where he led that for many, many years. He's here with us today in a different role, in that he experienced the death of his sister and his brother-in-law, and that experience of working with their healthcare teams brought a new perspective to his life's work. And he details this in a book that he has written called The Grief Connects Us. And he, through that book, has come to learn more about his opportunities to advocate for greater compassion and empathy and the way that we treat each other, and how our patients and how we can make specific, and he makes specific suggestions in his book about how we can improve healthcare delivery to achieve goals around being more compassionate and having greater empathy. So he's now dedicated his post-surgical career to teaching compassion in action within neurosurgery through communication skills building and integrating palliative care more into the world of neurosurgery. I am particularly fond of that because as a neuro-oncologist, I work with neurosurgery very closely, and so do my patients and their families. So this is really near and dear to my heart as well. So he has authored lots of opinion pieces, which I strongly recommend that you read. If you want to know where they are, let me know. I'd be glad to share those with you. He's published in New York Times, The Washington Post, Journal of Palliative Medicine, as well as World Neurosurgery. Funny enough, the universe works in kind of mysterious ways. I had heard about Dr. Stern in his book and his new endeavors in bringing palliative care concepts on a podcast that I listened to on an airplane. I can't remember where I was going at the time, but I remember thinking like, oh my goodness, this guy practices in the hospital that's 10 minutes from my cousin who lives in Greensboro, North Carolina. And this cousin is the son of my dad's oldest brother who died of ALS just as I was starting medical school. So I remember thinking like, I need to reach out to him. And as I was working up my chutzpah to email him, I had the email like going in my computer. Earlier this year, I walked into Vital Talk faculty training in Utah and saw on the list of other people who were going to be there his name, and I was like, what? So I walk into the room, and I didn't even know what he looked like, and I realized it was him, and then I just immediately just was so excited to have someone else in the world of neurosurgery who was very interested and passionate about doing things better. So with that all said, please join me in welcoming Dr. Stern.
Very much, Heather. It's great to be here. When I was listening to Benzie talking about community, this feels like a community, and okay, so I'm a neurosurgeon, but I check a lot of more boxes than I don't check in terms of, fitting in with you guys. So I'm really thrilled to be here. I have no disclosure. And you can see the list of people who have been actively engaged with me, and I'm delighted to be working with them and expanding my world. So thank you. So as Heather kind of said, I am did a lot of training at University of Michigan. I'm trained and practiced as a neurosurgeon in Greensboro, North Carolina. My younger sister, we'll get into that in a minute, but my younger sister developed acute leukemia, had a bone marrow transplant, and died. And that it was like stripping the veil off of my experience, and kind of what I thought I was doing as a doctor challenged me to think differently about that, and also to realize we can do better. I can do better. So I began writing and was lucky enough to get some articles published in the New York Times. I went to a course at Harvard on medical writing for medical professionals. I met an agent, and she said, I'd written my book, and she said, well, you got to rewrite it. It's not, no one's interested. She said, it was a memoir. She said, no one's interested in what you have to say. You're not a celebrity. So you need to rewrite it as a piece of prescriptive nonfiction. And so I basically rewrote it. I had to write a proposal after I'd written the book. And then she said, I think I can make this work. And she found me a publisher. That kind of took off. But I've been teaching. I was teaching UNC medical students while I was in Greensboro. And then I've recently joined the faculty at the University of Michigan, my alma mater, to work in neurosurgery, to teach communication training and to integrate palliative care into. So one of the first articles I wrote in the New York Times was "Grief is My Guide: How My Sister Made Me a Better Doctor." This is her. This is Victoria. She was in the hospital in Los Angeles, having had I think it was just after her bone marrow transplant. Actually, this was before her bone marrow, but we spent a bunch of time together. And then this is when we were growing up. We grew up in Washington, D.C. That's her on my mom's lap, and we spent our whole lives together. We grew up for 4 years in England, in London, England. This is walking through Kensington Palace Gardens with our dog, and she was always by my side. We were kind of linked. Well, your lives diverge, right? I became a neurosurgeon. That's a pretty full-time job. She became an actress and moved to Los Angeles, got married, had 2 children. She wrote a journal about her illness, and the real reason that I wrote the book was that she wrote this journal that she was convinced was going to be a one-woman play about surviving leukemia. And when she died, I didn't want that all to go away, and so I folded her journal into my writing about our journeys through this illness. And the thing that's funny when I listen to Benzie and I listen to you guys is that I was sort of going blind, like I was trying to figure all this stuff out because of what happened to me. When I listen to your advocates, you're thrust into a position that you didn't really choose or want, and probably would never sign up for. And yet in the process, you change and become a different person through that experience. She became different. Unfortunately, she died. But her observations, her reflections, I think, were very powerful. She was basically in the hospital, kind of taken away from her family for almost 8 months. And for a lot of that time, she was in a non-rebreathing situation because of her immunosuppression from her bone marrow transplant. So she was like cut off from the outside world. I remember one day I was sitting with her after her bone marrow transplant. We're in this sealed off room, and we're watching in the hospital grounds. They're having a celebration of survivors. It's so stark to be on that side of things. So this picture is of the day that my sister had her head shaved. She got tired of her hair all falling out. And one of the things I noticed, and you can see in this picture, is how she put pictures of her family up around her, because the hospital room is a pretty sterile environment. So she wanted to bring her family into that world. this is with her with her IV pole. She called it her stalker. She basically was continually infused with over 10 pumps, and they all beep all the time. And as a doctor, you learn how to kind of silence the beeps. We don't learn how to fix them. We just learn how to make them stop beeping. But she became she was tethered to this, and she got very frustrated because she said it was as if, she wasn't eating or drinking, and yet she was gaining weight and getting all these fluids. So it was a frustrating time. So one of the first realizations I had was, this is my sister, shaved head, stripped of her normal attire, now a patient. You've checked your identity at the door. You cease to be the person that you were. And few people recognize the vital, vibrant actress, mother, wife, person fully engaged in her life. This happened when she was 52, that she was just a few weeks before she developed what was a flu-like illness that never got better. And almost no one knew the little girl that I had grown up with that was embedded in my life, and even in her death, she's still there. So this led to a personal transformation. It was as if I went from seeing in black and white to suddenly seeing in color. And the realization came to me that this is each and every patient that we see and that we take care of, that we're privileged to take care of. And so often, we put up barriers to our experience. We don't want to feel the grief of what we're going through. We don't want to, we're reluctant, and I think oftentimes poorly trained told to keep our distance. And yet, that humanity, that connection between every single patient that we have is the most important thing that we do. So a year and a half later, this is my sister Victoria with her husband Pat. And a year and a half later, her husband ruptured an aneurysm in his brain and subsequently died. So suddenly I was on the receiving end of even more education on illness and death, because my sister was conscious and awake and alert throughout her illness, and then she developed sepsis as a result of her bone marrow transplant not working. The doctors kept going. They didn't really want to sit and talk to her. My sister was very reluctant to accept the idea that she might die. And her doctors were reluctant to really discuss that with her. So they kept substituting different kinds of chemotherapy, keeping the ball rolling. And she missed an opportunity to say goodbye to her family. When her husband ruptured his aneurysm, he was on blood thinners from a prosthetic heart valve. So he had a very massive hemorrhage because he, didn't clot his own blood. And then he basically was in a coma and he never woke up. And I was his healthcare power of attorney. So I was now in the deciding seat of what to do in terms of his care, decisions to make. And then again, I saw what it was like to be on the receiving end of healthcare. But this time I was in my own element, so I was this happened at UCLA. I was in the neuro ICU at UCLA for a couple of weeks. And I saw the place that I basically, it wasn't the same place, but they're pretty similar. The kind of situation that I had spent years of my life living and knew like the back of my hand. But I saw it with new eyes. So in this picture of their family, this is Nick, who's the taller boy, and Will, who's the smaller one. And Nick was the bone marrow donor for his mother and then did CPR on his father. And he looks and says, and neither of them worked. So you go from an intact family to 2 orphans. So these are some of the things I've learned, and then we're going to talk about how we need to change this. So I had always placed emotional armor, which is sort of a desire to protect myself from grief and from painful experiences. And I think I was trained, you can see the gray hair, I was kind of trained as a doctor a while ago, where this is the way we were taught. You're taught to keep your distance. You're not to get too involved. But then what do you do with the sorrow and the experiences if you have no training in how to handle them? Because the idea of just repressing it doesn't work. If you have emotional armor. First of all, it's a accreted defensive system that doesn't really work. It's poorly cobbled together. And the problem I recognized was it limits the richness of your lived experience. You can't turn it on and turn it off. It's either on or it's off. And so I realized I wanted to get rid of it. I also saw that compassion, which we've just talked about a lot, to see suffering and to want to relieve it, that's really a powerful force. I think that's, as I get older in neurosurgery, and I've done lots and lots of surgeries, I feel like the compassion part is more important, or every bit as important as the surgical medical part. And that compassion heals, and it's what we remember. You talked about your experiences with people lacking in compassion. They may have been having good intent, but they didn't deliver well. And the lack of compassion, I think, causes harm. I think compassion and hope and hopefulness has a very important curative impact. And I think we were talking about the metrics. It's what we measure, what we can measure, right? The stuff that is actually harder to get a handle on is probably more important. It's probably harder to measure. But that doesn't mean that it isn't valid and kind of central to what we're doing. So compassion must drive patient care and health systems. We talked about, can you care in a non-caring environment? And that's a long discussion. Brene Brown, in her talk about the power of vulnerability, said something that surprised me. I thought it was a great talk. And for me, I was going from a place like neurosurgery. We don't listen to Brene Brown. We don't. This is kind of like, who is this guy? What's happening? Is this a midlife crisis? But in her talk, she said that surgeons and pilots get a pass. We can't afford to be vulnerable. But I recognize that actually surgeons, I don't know about pilots. I think we have to be vulnerable. We have to take with us. We're ultimately in surgery, we're entrusted with someone's life, right? And we have to honor, respect, and be able to relate to that person's life, And so it's kind of a weird situation, because while I'm doing surgery, I'm very focused on what I'm doing, but I'm also thinking about the patient and, what I'm working on and why that part relates to their life and why it's important and why we need to preserve function. So I think that the vulnerability piece matters to all of us. So what have I learned? First, my story is far from unique. In my book, I interviewed, after I incorporated my sister's journal and my own journey, I then interviewed doctors and patients and doctors who became patients. And I had a fascinating conversation with a patient, a man that I had done. He was an organist, and I had done surgery on his brain, removed a grade 3 glioma, so kind of not super aggressive, but intermediate grade to aggressive tumor from what's called the supplementary motor area in his brain. And so the significance was that we got the whole thing out. It was a curative surgery. He's never had any recurrence, and yet his life was forever changed because he couldn't control his foot, so he couldn't play the organ anymore. And we don't tend, we look and say, it's kind of a joke, like in the neuro ICU, you say, is someone doing well? And they say, yeah, can you lift 2 fingers? And yes, well, then they're doing fine. It's like there's a big gap between lifting 2 fingers and a fully functioning, engaged life. So I also learned we're all going to become patients. And I realized we need new tools, something called emotional agility instead of armor. And I think this gets into the whole issue of presence, being mindful, being present when you're in the situation, and learning the skills to be able to have a meaningful, powerful conversation with the patient and family, not be afraid to cry, not be afraid to kind of express your own emotions, to connect meaningfully with that person, and then go to surgery and operate on that person. And the thing is, we're not taught how to do that. I think it is achievable, but I think it's hard, and I think we need help learning how to do that. So emotional agility allows for a range of conflicting emotions. And it's a better option. Life's beauty is inseparable from its fragility. And one of the things we just talked about, and I felt like we were given the same talk, different slides, different people, similar concepts. But emotional agility requires self-compassion. You know, we are, as neurosurgeons, generally fairly perfectionistic and very self-critical, and we don't tolerate failure. And so, but we always fail, right? So we're always going to have errors, we're always going to have problems, and if we're honest with ourselves, we are going to have failures. So how do we accept the reality? And we can't, the goal is to not have failures, the reality is we will, right? So how do you live in that space? And you have to have self-compassion. And I think it's a real struggle. You know, if I operate on 100 people and 98 do great and 2 don't do well, how do I calculate that? We're not taught how to do that. So a lot of times people say, and I think I'm preaching here to the choir, but a lot of times people say that I don't have time to have an empathetic relationship with a patient. But the reality is it takes 17 seconds to establish empathy. What it really takes is a willingness to go there, a willingness to avail yourself and to connect. And we a lot of times make excuses for why we can't. We're too busy. I've got too many cases. I got too many patients I'm taking care of. And those are really just excuses. So in one of the articles I wrote, it was in the New York Times, there was a young woman who was there for a reservoir to be placed in her brain for chemotherapy for breast cancer. And my sister had just died. And it was late in the day, and I was running late, and I had a whole bunch of stuff going on. And it's like I realized before I went into the room, I had a choice to make of, is this person a procedure to me, or is this person someone who has metastatic breast cancer, and you know how to get into that? And I just, at that point, I couldn't actually, just the barriers had fallen, and I just saw, you know, she was a mother. This is salvage chemotherapy, meaning she's not likely to live very long. She has a young child, and I was really kind of blown away by that. But I had a choice to make, and we have choices to make. How do we engage? Do we participate? Do we connect with people? So empathy and agility can both be taught. So this is Dr. Helen Rice is a professor of psychiatry at Harvard who wrote a book called The Empathy Effect, and basically has educational programs to develop empathy. And the thing, I found her to be very helpful to me because she taught me about emotional agility, and I think that you can look and say, these are trainable skills, you know. So the idea that, oh, well, that person is empathetic and you're not, you know, you go be a surgeon, you can, you know, be a palliative care doctor, you know. I mean, the reality is we all have to work together, and we all have to learn from each other. And, you know, it's funny when you talked about Gene Watson, I gave a talk in Italy with Gene Watson, and what was really fun about that was I was the surgeon talking about emotional connections, and she was the nurse and empathy expert talking about science. And it was really, because we have to bring them both together to be effective in both areas. I want to talk a little bit about burnout. You know, we know about it, exhaustion, alienation, and ineffectiveness. And I think you were alluding to this, Benzie, but you know, is it the intense emotions or the defenses against them? Because what I found was when I started to lean into this and I started to say, okay, I'm going to let myself have these emotional connections, I felt stronger, not weaker. I felt more energized. And my patients, I thought I was a pretty compassionate doctor when I started out, and I realized I could do a lot better. And when I made those connections and I wasn't afraid of them, I became a better doctor, and I became a better human being, and I found energy rather than feeling depleted. And that burnout is a normal response to unmitigated workplace stress. You know, we're the canaries in the coal mine. So one of the things we have to do, and I think this is part of the change in culture and the change in the world that we're talking about, this is a very sensitive area. If you start to really look carefully at what's going on, a lot of what we see we don't like. And we need to change the workplace. We need to change the demands on the workers and not just say, okay, the workers need to be more resilient in the existing systems, right? You're going to work 12 hours a day and you're going to do yoga. So the self-care and add-ons don't work. And then the other thing that's happening is that you see these half effective interventions in self-care, which we're not changing the system. We're going to let you do poetry and yoga. And then now there are papers coming out and saying, well, these things don't work, right? Well, they don't work because we're not really looking at the problems and we're not brave enough to face those problems. So it's not easy to prevent burnout. I think emotional connection, for me, has been extremely important. And it was kind of interesting in my personal journey is that I injured my elbow. I became very disenchanted with my health system. I kind of retreated into this constant operating, do what I can do, I can't fix the other changes. And I actually hurt my arm to the point where I had to stop operating. And so then that was a really disruptive personal experience for me. And I ended up changing what I'm doing. So now I got training. The training in palliative care was different because the training in palliative care was, I had written this book, I had published the book, and I was advocating for palliative care. But I thought, well, I really don't know enough about palliative care to be an advocate, so I wanted to get training. So there's a program through Harvard Medical School, a palliative care education and practice, and it's for mid-career professionals. I didn't want to go and do a fellowship, but I wanted to get some training and learn. And what I was really surprised by is that it was mostly about communication training. I thought it would be technical symptom management, and it really was more about how do we talk to people. And I think it's interesting when Benzie, you said about this seems to be the source of wisdom. It's an irony. We're carrying a pretty large burden, right? Like when you come in and you're consulting and you're providing effective communication, why is that necessary? I was giving a talk in Australia this spring, and a palliative care doctor said, why is it that palliative care has been assigned the area of communication? I mean, that's a part of our fragmented systems. Like, why aren't all doctors able and trained in communication? It's a failure of communication when you have to bring in someone to communicate. So I've become very involved in an organization called One World Surgery, and we do surgery in Honduras and Dominican Republic. And then I've gotten involved in teaching. So I trained in palliative care for growth personally, but to develop new skills as an advocate. So here I am, an advocate, right? And to improve communications and care. That's where we met Heather. We're now learning Vital Talk techniques. So this was a program through Harvard Medical School, remote due to COVID. And we had a project, and in that project, one of the things we did was developing skills maps and communication training and listening skills, exploring teamwork, role-playing with professional actors, and finding a safe space to learn and to grow. So I found it very powerful to role-play and to try communication techniques out. And, we don't do perfectly. A lot of times the way we're taught communication is we tag along with someone who either is very good or very bad at communication, but you learn by example. And it's important to learn your own techniques and to do it in a way that you can afford to make mistakes. So at my health system in North Carolina, at the same time, there was the CEO had there's a video from her in just a second, but the CEO, Mary Jo Cagle, is trained as an OBGYN, and her mother had a subdural hemorrhage and was in the ICU in another big academic center and was doing terribly, and she was getting horrible input and advice. So she was very frustrated. She called me, and I kind of helped walk her through this. So then we talked about creating an integrated program, bringing palliative care into the neuro ICU. It seemed very wrong to me that it shouldn't be attending dependent whether you get good communication and good care. It should be more standardized. So the idea was to bring nurse practitioners in and really to focus on communications. And then also developing teamwork, offloading the doctors, right? If we're doing surgery, doing all this other stuff, it's not possible to do everything. So providing a supportive environment for the clinicians and for the patients and for their families. And so I set that up, and that fell apart. And it fell apart largely because of funding constraints, because the way we value things in our health systems, if I'm valued as a neurosurgeon because I generate a lot of revenue, I ordered a lot of tests, I do a lot of surgeries, and those are expensive. If I start sitting and talking to patients and doing palliative care, it's suddenly, well, that's not really helpful. And then it's so ironic that you're looking at all these kind of surveys and metrics to try to get at the humanity of the health system. And I said, I said to the CEO, I said, just focus on this and really do it well, and you'll blow away all the metrics, because this is what people want to see. But I think they lack courage to do that. Anyway, this video I'm going to show you is Dr. Cagle's experience in academic medical center with her mother with a subdural hemorrhage and what it was like to be on the receiving end of healthcare. And I look and I go, okay, so this is a CEO of a health system. She is a practicing doctor, and this was her experience. If it works. I don't think it works. Uh-oh. Let me see if I can go back. Unfortunately, the video did not take. She talked about how she was not seen. She felt dismissed. She said that nobody was available to explain things. She said that her mother had advanced directives and they had engaged palliative care. But she said that the doctors, they were a combination of neurosurgeons, intensivists, all across the board, really had no empathy, showed no empathy. She told me a story of how when they had made a decision that they were going to withdraw treatment and give her a timed trial to extubation. But then the extubation trial ended on the weekend, and all the staff had changed, and the attending who was there said, I don't have time for this, And so she ended up extubating her own mom. And then that caused a big problem, you can't do this. Like, well, you're not listening, you're not doing any of the things you agreed to do. But it's fascinating to me that, and what she advocates for is training for and teamwork for practitioners to understand what's involved, understand what it's like to be on the receiving end. And I think, I don't know about all of you, but I think a lot of you are here because you felt at one point this became clear to you. It's kind of like being dropped in hot oil. It's a pretty painful experience. And just like with my sister and with her husband, there's kind of no going back. Like when you see that and you see where things are and where things aren't, and where they could be and where they should be, you can't do business as usual. So she gives a very impassioned talk about how that we really need to be better trained. We really need to be more sensitive, empathetic, and understanding of what it's like to be a patient in the ICU. After my course at Harvard, I wrote this is an opinion piece that appeared in Journal of Palliative Medicine. Why should a neurosurgeon train in palliative care anyway? And I was pleased that Benzie was telling me that there are surgeons that are becoming engaged in fellowships, and that we're starting to see this divide changing, and I think that's super important. So I have now set off. I left my practice in North Carolina. I have to admit that I was frustrated when all of our desires to change the neuro-ICU didn't work out. I have now taken my efforts to Michigan, and we'll talk about that in a second. But there's a real need for palliative care in neurosurgery because care is bifurcated. There's too much of a division between the technical and the emotional, and the reality is that both matter, right? You don't want a super empathetic doctor who doesn't know what they're doing, but you also don't want a cold technician who doesn't treat you like a human being. They both matter. They're both, and they should both be, we've done this strange process of dividing them, of separating them. They both need to be reintegrated. And I think in the acute care setting, it's extremely important. There are unique requirements, and we need, I think the way I was able to kind of sell it to my partners was to say, you know, neurosurgeons are overworked, you know, so we're going to do something with teamwork. We're going to give you some support to maybe to improve the care and also to lighten the load that you're carrying. So I'm advocating for earlier involvement, frequent touches, consistent messaging, and training. Matters who delivers the message. You know, is it the palliative care provider? I think there's some unique requirements from surgeons. We're actively engaged in the care. You know, it makes a big difference if you do surgery on a patient and then say they have a complication. You're in a potentially defensive, potentially litigation situation. So it makes a big difference who's delivering the message. Also, patients oftentimes want to have hope, and will, you know, with the surgeon saying, you know, let's keep going, and you're the kind of bringer of hope, and then to turn around and say, when the palliative care person says, you know, a lot of people will say, I don't even want palliative care because that means that they're going to be dying. And I think that there's a real disconnect in messaging between the wisdom and the support piece and the idea that palliative care means that we're stopping. So I found, first of all, I didn't know about you guys, and I didn't know that there were neurosurgeons who were interested in palliative care. So I started this group with some residents who are all interested in palliative care. So Adela Wu is a resident at Stanford. I'm going to show a couple of her slides later. And then also Stephen Miranda at Penn, and Miri Kim, who was at Loyola and then went to Yale. And these are next generation. I realized I can't change the practitioners right now. I can't change my partners. I got to go upstream. I got to go start talking to residents and to trainees and to see if we can make a difference. And they're all passionately invested in the idea of change. So I, with Heather, have been training in Vital Talk and learning how to become a communicator. And it's the difference between I took the course, but now I'm taking the course to become the teacher. And I think it's interesting that improved communication, it improves patient satisfaction, and at the same time increases resilience and decreases the ethical distress among practitioners. So this, I think probably you guys all know about this, but it grew out of palliative care and oncology. And at Michigan, we do this thing where something called Vital Talk, they want to change it and give it a block M, and they call it M Talk, right? So they've rebranded it, but it's basically they're training practitioners. And so right now, there are over 1,000 people who have been trained in M-Talk at Michigan. These are all internal medicine and medicine specialties, anesthesia, no surgeons, okay? No neurosurgeons. So I'm bringing this with existing faculty to neurosurgery and to other surgical areas. And we're going to work on serious illness conversations such as goals of care, shared decision making, you know, how do we deal with adverse operative events, looking at chronic conditions, those kinds of things. So I've been working with a guy named Jonathan Fisher, who's at Duke, who worked with Brittany Davidson, and this is working in OBGYN, doing training for adverse operative results and how it's helpful for patients and also helpful for the practitioners. There has been an effort in neurosurgery, this again was at Duke, of difficult conversations and training how to educate patients and practitioners in better communication. But these efforts have been sporadic. They happen for a year or two, and then they fade away. And this was several years ago, and it was not repeated. So trying to get traction and change and sustain change is one of my challenges. So ACGME is looking for better communication training and recognizes it is important for patients and providers and to create standards in training and practice. So I'm kind of on the curve. This is not something revolutionary. This is taking something that's already established and proven and effective and not exposed at all to surgeons and bringing that to them. So I was fortunate to be able to teach at American Association of Neurological Surgeons in Chicago in May. The title was What Matters, and we had a practical course at that conference on the evolution of palliative care and its relevance to neurosurgical practice. And I just want to take a second and talk about the people in this picture. Basically, this is a community, all right? Mary Buss is a palliative care doctor in Boston. Laura Taylor's at Michigan. This is Jonathan Fisher. This is me. This is Adela, and I'm going to show her some slides. So she's a resident in neurosurgery. Suzanne Muhlschlegel is a neurologist at Hopkins. This is Kate Drummond, who is a head of neurosurgery in Australia, in Melbourne, Australia, at the Royal Melbourne Hospital. Dr. Miranda is resident in neurosurgery at Penn, and Dr. Kim is a neurosurgery neuro-oncologist getting fellowship training at Yale. So the thing is, we're starting to build a community across disciplines to work together to to change the practice of neurosurgery. We talked about why we need palliative care in neurosurgery, the importance of teamwork. How is this done outside of the US? You know, we're not isolated. There are a lot of other people doing the same kinds of things, and we can learn from them and work with them. Talking about, we did a practical course on using skills maps and vital talk training and communication training geared for neurosurgery. So there are a couple of challenges about bringing palliative care into the neuro-ICU or bringing palliative care into the neurosurgery. One is neuroprognostication. It's very problematic. It's very difficult to assess how someone is going to end up. And one of the things I thought was fascinating in Chicago is we did the kind of weekend after the conference course, but during the actual plenary session, one of the neurotrauma doctors stood up and said, the biggest cause of death in neurotrauma is medical nihilism, a therapeutic nihilism, meaning that palliative care is withdrawing treatment and people are dying as a result of that. And so they're saying, yes, palliative care is important on the side, but in the main session, we really can't afford to have palliative care in neurosurgery because that people will get unplugged. And there's so many problems. That's such a complicated question or issue. But I think that one of the things that I found in my experience with my brother-in-law was we only got palliative care involved when we were talking about withdrawing treatment. After the decision to withdraw treatment had been made, palliative care was wonderful, but it was basically fancy funeral planning because we'd already made all the decisions. No one knew that only a year earlier their mother had died, that the two children were going to be orphaned, and the weight of the responsibility, the impact of this situation on them. And so palliative care, when I look at palliative care, I think there's a big gap in the care that we're providing. You know, they were talking about the external ventricular drain, they were talking about the craniotomy for aneurysm, but nobody was talking about what's the impact on this bomb going off in our family. And so I want to bring palliative care in earlier, not to withdraw treatment, but to provide support. And there are some fundamental issues when you say, we can't prognosticate, well, then what are we going to do? Are we just going to keep our distance and not really comment because we can't? Well, that's increasing suffering. Or do you support people and say, we really can't? I think there are ways of supporting without being plug pullers. But I think that's a problem we have to work through in terms of messaging and communication, and particularly in my field. So some things I've learned from you guys, Dr. Kreutzfeld, in terms of the fourth trajectory and also the disability paradox, I've learned from your book. I think it's wonderful. These are some of the slides that we showed at this conference, and looking at the continuum of basically the need for palliative care and why it's important in neurosurgical patients. How would they need to come together to really buoy up and support patients and families. and this was something we said, that teamwork and multidisciplinary collaboration are key for effective communication and compassionate, culturally sensitive, and quality care for our neurosurgical patients. And I'm just going to show a little bit of Adela's story because I think it's fascinating. So she's her parents are Chinese. She's a first-generation U.S.-born Chinese, and she's now a neurosurgery resident at Stanford. And she told a story of basically how her father had, I think, almost 18 brain surgeries, and continual care. Family was not interested in palliative care. So it was offered to them, but it was really culturally, they didn't want to accept it. And she then realized the importance of this and how to, it's important to bring in culturally sensitive palliative care into neurosurgery. She's a great writer. She's an artist. So it brings in the creative spirit, and from that, we've developed collaborations both at Michigan and also at Stanford in terms of developing culturally sensitive palliative care integration with neurosurgical practice, and we're trying to do the same thing at Michigan. So these are a couple of things that she's published related to that. So now let's talk next steps. Okay, so I'm here, so I want, what do I want? Okay, or what am I doing? Went to Australia. They were very receptive to palliative care and neurosurgery. We had a couple of big meetings where there was palliative care and neurosurgery working together and talking together. And we're talking about palliative care integration in neurosurgery. And also I've developed communication training for neurosurgeons. We're here. One of the things I would like to achieve with this visit is Suzanne Muehlschlegel said, you know, these guys are already doing this. You need to meet Dr. Benzel and Kreutzfeld and start talking with them. That's already happening. And I realized I'm not going to reinvent the wheel. You guys have a tremendous amount of expertise. We need to band together to strengthen numbers and to look and say that there's more that unites us than separates us from neurosurgery and neurology. So I would propose, my understanding is there's 200 neurologists in this organization and there are 3 neurosurgeons. And my proposal is that we create a neurosurgery subsection that we can address some of the unique features of neurosurgical care from a palliative care context. I feel like I'm walking in your shadow. So we did this talk in Chicago, and Springer Nature Press said, you want to write a book about palliative care in neurosurgery? So I now have a contract to write a book on palliative care in neurosurgery, a practical guide looking at communication training. It's going to be, you know, not the theory, maybe a little theory, but more how to do this, some of the tools, some of the neurosurgery specific cases. And so I have been, one of the things that I think is definitely the case is that I feel like I've gone from kind of ego-driven neurosurgeon to kind of like, I'm doing this because this is the right thing to do. And I think that's a pretty powerful position to be in. So I just went to Duke on Wednesday. We did grand rounds for the neurosurgery department and did a vital talk training for 15 of the neurosurgeons. And people are interested. We're going to do the same thing at the University of Michigan. We're going to do it at Stanford. I've been invited back to do it in Australia. We're looking at neurosurgery-specific cases and also best case and worst case, and giving people the tools to be able to communicate effectively with patients and families. And there was this one moment at Duke where I said, you know, artful communication is every bit as important as doing a complex brain surgery, right? You need to learn the skills. We're taught endlessly how to do the technical brain surgery. And one of the interns said, I have a real hard time with some of these conversations. And it's like he's doing them on his own. He's, 2 months into being a doctor. Nobody's teaching him. Nobody's mentoring him. That needs to be an emphasized part of training. So we must chart our future through communication, collaboration, research, and developing best practices. We need to be the change we want to see. I'm thankful to my sister, and although she died, she put me on a different trajectory, and I'm kind of pleased with that. This is the book that I wrote, And also, if you want to get any of the reprints through, some of the articles, you can get them through my website, which is josephsternmd.com. But this is the book, Grief Connects Us, A Neurosurgeon's Lessons on Love, Loss, and Compassion. And, I think I learned a lot writing that book. I know more now. I listen to you guys. The thing that one of the most powerful parts of this journey has been the community that I have made and the people that I've met. And I learned from all of you. And so that is a powerful part of this process for me. So thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much. It sounds like ultimately your sister gave you a really, really powerful and really big gift. She probably didn't realize that's what was going to happen, but that's exactly what she did. And I think she would be unbelievably proud and excited to hear about all the things that you're doing. So if there are any questions that anyone would like to pose in the few minutes that's separating you from a bathroom break, please do.
Hi, Jody. I think on behalf of all of us, thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for inspiring a really important change. And I do have a question, and I know we can talk about more of this offline as we already have about some of the challenges. But I think we as neurologists maybe understand neurosurgeons in a different way than our other colleagues in palliative care. And I think the way that I grew up in neurology, working very closely with neurosurgeons and honoring their training, their expertise, their skill, sometimes it felt okay to have the bad conversations for them. And I love this idea of the partnership, that it may not be a perfect world. They don't have enough time necessarily to do exactly what we do, but doing it together, I think, becomes really important from a place of trust and support. My challenge question for you, and this comes from my own personal experience and joy of being at the same place as I grew up in my career, is that I have had professional relationships with neurosurgeons that have become my very close friends and have allowed me to kind of hold their best kept secrets. And I challenge you to think about, what does self-care for a neurosurgeon look like? So neurosurgeons that I have worked with, particularly in the realm of neuro-oncology, have found my company, my office, a stairwell, maybe a safe place to share what they're really going through with this idea of grief and loss. And a lot of times I think I see the people that are vulnerable enough to share that are incredibly rare. And I see that the emotional armor extends into the self-care or the lack of it. So that's obviously a bigger monster than communication skills, but I'm super interested to see if you think there's space for that as well. So thank you.
I guess my answer is I agree. I think it's really tough, and I think one of the people I work with, Devanya, who works in the OR at Cone Hospital, she looked at my book and she said, "This is basically you writing a book of Dr. Stern becomes a human being," and so I kind of. But I also thought she was kind of right. It's like some things come easier to some people, and we all have different skills, but I think we all need to at least strive for this, and we need to support each other to get there. And I think for me, so much of, I think it's hard to do these things, but I also think it's essential. It's essential to have a long and productive, meaningful career. And so many of the lessons we're given about commodifying medicine and turning it into a business and looking at it as, you're measuring not your humanity, but your productivity. There's so many messed up incentives. But there are also people who are well-meaning and pretty bright who could gain from having those skills. And I've often thought, well, okay, my experience, would I have been receptive to what I have learned now earlier? And the answer is maybe not. But I think what I could have benefited from is having the skills and having the concepts, so I didn't have to go and discover them myself, and then discover that actually there are a lot of people who have the same experiences and they've learned the hard way. And some people, you know, if I made some discoveries, many people probably never do. And I think there's lots of distractions along the way. You look at substance abuse and kind of, you know, hyper consumerism and all kinds of things are ways of kind of blunting the sorrow. And the thing is that the reality is we can do so much better. We need to do much better, and patients will benefit, and so will all of us. So it's simple solution.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello. Thank you for sharing your experiences. My name is Jeremy Reynoso, second-year medical student at Michigan State University, College of Human Medicine, so just down the street.
Sure.
Particularly interested in neuro-onc, anesthesia, and neurosurgery. So for the past 6 years, I've done cancer research at UCLA, and I've always believed that the best form of treatment that patients can ever obtain is one that cures them. One that removes their illness through, you know, the miracle drug, the miracle surgery. However, recently in my rotations, I was introduced to palliative medicine, and I was impressed in particular with a paper by Patrick in New England Journal of Medicine, suggesting that early intervention with palliative treatment actually extends patient survival compared to that with aggressive chemotherapy alone. So I'd like to kindly ask, do you know if there's any ongoing research that actually suggests this patient survival with the newer agents like targeted therapies and immune checkpoint inhibitors? And then secondly, I'd like to ask, through your personal experience on the patients that you work on for aggressive cancers like glioblastoma, do you actually see that survival benefit, that increase for patients when you provide them with this palliative emotional connection compared to other institutions that don't really have, you know, a strong palliative framework? Yeah, thank you.
So I'm going to defer on the first question because I think we get experts who can probably answer that a lot better than I can. I will say that my goal of changing culture is very early. And so I think that it is to say that the culture at Michigan has changed because I showed up would be very naive. And I think that I'm at the very beginning of this journey of trying to impact cultures and change. So I think when I talked at Duke, the chairman said, you know, how are you measuring this? You know, how are you measuring the impact? And I think that's important. You can say, well, I'm doing the right thing, and that won't get you very far, right? So the question is it making an impact? And you have to have bite-sized pieces to really be able to study instead of sweeping, you know, generalizations. I know that it's important. We know that it's important. I think the challenge is measuring that impact. You know, in the OBGYN, it was nice because it was a pretty focused study and showing, you know, with specific interventions, did this improve patient satisfaction, improve resilience. It improves the resilience of the practitioners. So you can measure these things. But in terms of, I feel a bit like, you know, I'm pushing a train. You know, I'm trying to change cultures that are really invested in being how they are and are not really interested in changing. And the only way we can change them is to come together and to speak with more than one voice and to recognize the key reasons we became physicians, the key reasons we take care of patients, the privileged position we are in to take care of people, and that we have to be the ones defining the medical care that we provide, not letting systems define us and the care. So that is my mission, but I'm not there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Go ahead. We're running out of, I don't want to take the bathroom break that I think everyone's needing, but go ahead, but maybe go to Essence.
You bet. I'm Andrew Wong from the University of Rochester. Thank you so much for your talk. I just was really intrigued and resonating with, and I wanted to ask you a little bit. You talked about palliative care early as sometimes the roles are different. Plug puller, symptom management. I think other people talk about just navigating illness. I'm just curious to hear you talk a little bit more about that and how your relationship was to that.
Well, I knew what I needed and what our family needed, and it was very much someone to walk with us and to spend time and to guide us. And so that's what I saw as the huge gap. But when I talk to, say, neurointensivists, or I talk to neurosurgeons, they think of palliative care as pulling the plug. And that's not what I think it is. And I think that's, and as you said, you can have bad palliative care doctors too, but the reality is there has to be built into the system a way to support and explain and guide people, So one of the most empathic people that I dealt with in that entire hospitalization was a nurse who was just kind. So that's where we need to go. We need to bring that into the care.
Would it be okay if I added something?
Sure.
So if you look in the literature and if you listen to Jerry Pell podcasts where Jennifer Temmel and other palliative care researchers are talking, when they talk about early palliative care, it's for coping support and psychological support and developing a rapport so that when stormier times come, you're not trying to build the plane while you're flying it. And so I think that the more work we can do to help our colleagues who know us at our institutions understand that you're not there to hang the crepe and that you're not there to be the people who only talk about death and dying, but to talk about support and what can we do to come alongside you through this illness with your family member, with you as the person who's ill. I think we need to be much more loud about that message.
I think one of the important differences between neurology and neurosurgery in this regard is how you bring your patients in. Like if you make a diagnosis and then they have this progressive illness, you have lots of touches and lots of interaction, and you can walk with someone. Many of the times, say neurotrauma or vascular, people are coming in a crisis, right? And then you have to make enormous, weighty decisions without a lot of experience with the families. It's very much crisis-driven. That's not all we do, but it's a big chunk of it.
Please.
Hi, Steve Panelat from UC San Francisco. Thank you so much for your presentation and for your work. Through a long career in palliative medicine, I've noticed that people like you in the field of neurosurgery can have a lot of legitimacy that is harder for those of us outside the field. And so I just want to thank you for embracing this and bringing it to neurosurgery. I think there's a way that people can hear your voice in a way from your experience that is harder for those of us who are not in that field. And I want to thank you also for the comment, and it's come up now a couple times, just about reminding us in palliative care that we have to do the work that we say we do, which is to help our patients live as well as possible for as long as possible. And I worry that there are times that we approach the bedside not with nihilism, frankly, and that can be harmful to patients, and that it's important for us to really focus on the work that we say we do, which is, again, help people live well and live long and walk with them in their illness. So thank you for that reminder. And then the last thing I'll say is welcome to the community. We're delighted to have you. So thank you.
Thank
you. Did you have something you wanted to add?
If it's okay, do I have time to ask a question?
If you can go to Essence quickly, yes.
Absolutely. Hi, Jessica Irwin from Remo Health. I am a registered nurse. I spent my formative years in the neurointensive care, and Unfortunately, due to very similar circumstances that you shared, and I'm so sorry that you did experience those with your family, is why I'm no longer there. And I'm just curious to hear your thoughts, and I wrote it down as you were talking. You know, when you're having to go from one room where a family is having to come to terms with an individual, their loved one approaching brain death, and Life Bank is now involved, and then you're going into the next room preparing for a shunt placement. What strategies and how would you share with those new neurosurgeons that are coming up, and the nurses that are working so closely with them to understand how to help maintain that compassionate approach without becoming so emotionally overwhelmed that it becomes almost boilerplate experience for each different family. So those families feel uniquely supported in their very unique circumstances.
Well, I totally appreciate where you're coming from. I think the answer is kind of what we've talked about is being present, right? It is, we live so much of our lives in the future and in the past, and what just happened is not relevant to this other person. You're burdening them if you bring that in. And so by being present and focused on what is going on in front of you, you, I think, can navigate that. And just as also, I think it's important to, if you're in the experience of, grief or whatever you're dealing with in the previous room, and you allow yourself to experience it, I think you can rebound more quickly than you think. I think a lot of times it's because you kind of stuff it away, that it corrodes your life. So I think being present is and mindful, I think, are super important.
Thank you.
Same within doing surgery, being present and mindful. My job right now is what I'm doing right in front of me.
Thank you for all the great questions. Thank you, Dr. Stern.
Thanks a lot.
So